SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Lecture 6 in our course Appreciating and Writing Popular English Non-Fiction Books. Lecture 6 is, again, we are going to talk about research for popular non-fiction. This is the second of a two-part series of lectures. Today we are going to talk about good practice in research, red flags, verification, pitfalls in ethics, and knowing when to stop. In Lecture 5, we began talking about research. As I pointed out, research is the most essential component of non-fiction books. You could have writers who are great stylists, but you will have to do good research. There is no negotiating that particular element. Good research is really the backbone of a good non-fiction book. Not only does it provide good content, it provides perhaps a new way of looking at things, a new kind of argument, but also it informs style and form, as we saw in the last lecture when we looked at a few examples of books. Now, as I said, since non-fiction demands such a high standard of research, let's talk a little bit more about how we kind of conduct research for non-fiction books. Where does one begin, for instance? I'm sure that each writer has a different process, but for me as a practitioner personally, I like to begin with the library. I start with doing background research. When I say library, I said it before that it does not have to be a physical library. It could be an internet search, it could be a collection of books that you have assembled, or papers, talks, whatever. All of that would constitute library as long as it is background and reference material. The purpose of this kind of reading to start with for me is simply to give me the background and the context within which my particular venture will fit in. Let me explain. It might be that over time, usually a book doesn't kind of happen overnight. You know, the idea might come, but there will be a certain amount of preparation before. Perhaps unconsciously one has started to sort of look out for little tidbits of information. One has been saving some papers or certain articles, putting aside, titles of books to read at the right time. And then when the idea comes of some kind of reference material already saved on one's computer, the mind has been working this particular project without actually perhaps consciously knowing it. At the point at which at least I like to start a project, we'll first start by reading everything I can about which is available to me at that point, or which I can collect. As I said, what that does is it's like going to a new surveying the landscape, looking at a map, for instance, to know itself, or where is one's project positioned in this wide landscape. This has many kind of advantages. What it does is the sources of data, the potential sources of data. We can always, and it allows you to say, okay, I am here within this, knowing that my new research might lead me here or here. But once you get an idea of the terrain, it becomes a little easier to move around. It also becomes easier to know what sort of questions to begin to ask, which you will refine over time. So having said that, as I said, these are the advantages of starting with what I'm calling the library, which is a sort of background research. It's a bit like, if you have to look at an example from another field, let's say an artist, when the artist prepares the canvas, uh, stretches the canvas, applies the primer, setting the kind of stage for, having the kind of blank space prepared and ready to kind of decide when to put the first dot of paint, and then let things proceed as they will. Exploring the library, as I said, for me at least, works the same way. It gives me a very broad understanding within which I am emboldened to roam a little more freely. Now, as I said, you will find at this point, when you look at all your reference material, you will not understand it all at once. In fact, it could be intimidating in its largeness and scope. But what happens is that over time, and this is of course just the first reading, it will not be the last. By no means will it be the last. You will return to it again and again with more information, and you will read it better, because each time you will come back with more data, a greater understanding. So one should not be kind of frightened by the fact that the terrain seems so large and so much available data already present. Just read it. That's what I do. I just read it, try and absorb as much as I can, make notes, jot down points which seem interesting. One is likely to throw them away later, but at that point, it helps just to get some sort of grasp of the material. Having done that, having kind of acquired some familiarity with the background reading, what next? My suggestion is that in all likelihood, the reading itself will suggest the next path. It will tell you where to go next. Okay. In lecture 5, we spoke about the difference between doing research for academic work and market research, for instance, where the researcher is guided by disciplinary or institutional requirements or commercial constraints, commercial applications. And as we observed in popular non-fiction, there is a far greater degree of freedom and flexibility. I'm sorry, I think I've gone a slide. Okay. We also talked about, so we said that there is a far greater flexibility in research methodology when we're talking about popular non-fiction. We also talked about primary research and secondary research. To put it very briefly, primary research involves collecting new data for the first time, while secondary research uses data that has already been collected. Now, what should you look at first? So, we start with background, a familiarity, kind of acquiring a familiarity with the background material, reference material, try and kind of understand the scope of where we are placed. And then we come to, let's say, commencing research. What do we do first? Do we do primary or secondary data? As I mentioned, it makes sense to start with secondary data, which is the background reference sort of material. But unless one has already done some thinking on this subject and needs to start with perhaps at least one primary source or the other. But as I said the last time, there are no fixed rules, and very often the kind of progress of your research will depend on many things, particularly on circumstances and practical considerations. So, for instance, because, as I said, resources are typically very limited, and one has to kind of work within certain constraints of time, funding, and so on. Let's say you are traveling to a town where some of your informants live. Even if you are not ready to meet with, some of them might be primary sources, and yet you may not be ready to meet them. But because you're going to that place and might not return, it does make sense to schedule an interview. Another reason to perhaps prioritize certain interviews would be if a subject is extremely aging or very ill, and it might be that, does not have the strength at a later stage to talk to you. So again, these are sort of considerations that one must sort of weigh while starting research. So one kind of plays it by ear and does what one has to. I find that mixing secondary and primary sources, kind of switching between the two is actually quite helpful. It does help even more if you know that you have the possibility of going back to a source, which sometimes you don't have. Sometimes you know that that person has very limited time and that one interview is all you're going to get. Then you do kind of try and prepare as much as you can for that interview. But if you do have a bit of flexibility, then I find mixing the two helps. As I said, again, one weighs the pros and cons. Sometimes you're meeting a very important primary source. You don't want to you don't want to go not as well prepared as you can be, because the first very raw sort of response might be the very kind of valuable response that you are looking for. But the reason why I'm saying it kind of sometimes helps to mix the two is because, as I said, your style and your form is very much guided by what you're finding. Also, the kind of the direction of your book. You might start with some idea that this is what interests me and this is why I'm pursuing this subject. And you might find, as things come to you, you might find that there is a better way of a better form within which to put it. I mean, you might start out thinking that you are going to do, for instance, a very large survey of a subject, of an idea, a kind of a contemporary history, let's say, of a certain event, and then or a certain place, and then you might think that, or you might find that actually the details you are getting are inviting you to change your stance, to maybe use a biographical form instead. As I said, this is what research throws up, and so it's important to let the research guide you as well as you guide the research. Okay. Now, having said this, let us revisit the various examples briefly we looked at in the previous lecture, which showed us some of the ways in which popular nonfiction writers go about doing research. We saw, for instance, the kind of varied approaches. We saw a writer using public archives, another looking at legal history through court records. We also saw a writer relying heavily on interviews. So these are some of the sources that writers use, as well as academic researchers also use. There is quite a bit of overlap between the sources. The last time we listed some of the conventional sources: the library, which we mentioned just now, the archive, the method of interviews. Let's just go back a bit to them and discuss them in slightly better detail, just because not all my viewers, I assume, are familiar with, let's say, the archives. What is an archive? As we defined it in the last lecture, it's an accumulation of historical records or materials in any medium or the physical facility in which they are located. So research in the archive is usually primary research. Now, when one mentions the word archive, one usually thinks of historical research. And it is true that archives are a window into the past, and conventionally it is historians who tend to use the archive. You're looking at correspondence dating, 100 years back, or you're looking at shipping records 200 years back, and so on. So you think that, it's only the historian who goes into the archive. But that is really not necessarily so. The archives can be a really rich database also for contemporary research. You can get you can get the kind of background material to, let's say, for instance, a new law is passed, a new law on, let's say, a censorship law is passed, and you think that it's passed this week, so it's a very contemporary event. But you could go into the archives and look at certain documents, look at sort of historical resonances to this particular event that has taken place this week. and you might not need to insert all that data, but it will allow you to it will enrich in your own understanding, or a context, your ability to contextualize what has happened last week in the light of what has happened before. And by doing that, you probably arrive at a truer argument, a truer kind of understanding of the meaning and significance of this event. Um, the other people who use archives commonly, and this is a kind of a very current sort of trend of people trying to find their roots, people looking into family histories, for instance. So on my visits to the archives, in fact, I've often found extremely people who are not researchers or scholars or writers or historians, but just ordinary people looking for an uncle who was perhaps sort of had traveled somewhere, and now they're very curious to kind of explore what he was doing. The people who looking into the sort of their genealogy and lineage, and it's really, now the archives have become kind of a rich source of material for all kinds of different kinds of research. So it's not only historians and people looking only into the past for the purpose of writing about the past who are looking into the archives. And I think more non-fiction writers might have a use for archives if they kind of understood the many possibilities. Now, as I said, one thinks of archives in terms of public archives, such as the national archives, usually set up by various governments. And you can find in these public archives documents related to any official activity, such as licenses, correspondence, government correspondence, municipal correspondence, laws, etc., and so on and so forth, policy papers, discussions, things like that. But there are also private archives, collections for an institution or an individual. Sometimes families of descendants of someone of some significance might retain the person's personal belongings, and that can be a rich sort of treasure trove to know if you're going to be writing about a certain individual, or you are kind of trying to get a sense of an era and you have access to the personal library of that person. It's kind of quite helpful to see what were the kind of books that person read, what were the kind of issues that interested that person, so on and so forth. So it is very interesting. Again, for instance, I was once writing about someone who had a great interest in music, just as a listener. And I was very keen to see if that person's music collection was still available, where I could just look at it, just to know what were the records that person listened to at the time. Sadly, that information was not available, but I did get some information on the kind of books that person read, and that it's a kind of fascinating peek into an individual's, into the various things that make up an individual personality. So as I said, there are private museums, companies have archives, so there are institutional archives, and while we're talking about archives, we can extend that to museums as well. And museums, or where you have, whether they are of textiles, or whether they have collections of paintings and so on, all these objects, for instance, there are museums. There is a museum that I was looking at in a port town, for instance, where they had the little objects that were traded by travelers. There's another museum I went to in Mauritius where they had little bits of crockery from the ships that had come in, and they had these a few sort of little belongings, very meager belongings that belonged to the indentured workers who had gone from India over there. And these were all showcased, and just looking at that gives you a sort of sense of a life, of a time, of a world, a sense of hierarchy, sense of the differences between, for instance, the British captains who came and were using that crockery, and the indentured workers who had this one pot in which they probably cooked their meals. So there are many ways of getting a sense of the past or the present. It's not just documents, it's objects, it's music, it's all sorts of things. Trees, for instance. Again, I went to one museum where they just had the kind of plants that were grown by workers in that area. And again, just the idea of the plants, the look of the plant, the color of the flowers, the fragrance of the leaves. You get a sense. You get a sense of atmosphere. These are things that are particularly important for popular nonfiction. It might not be for other fields. As I said, market research might not have much use for these kind of details, but for a popular nonfiction writer, these are very important. And as I said, so the sources from which you procure your information are many and varied, and the archives can be an extremely rich resource. Now, this might be basic for some of you who have used libraries and archives frequently, but I find that very often for many people, they start using the first visit to an archive happens at a much later stage in their professional career. So I'm going to kind of run through a few tips on how to use libraries and archives, and bear with me if you already know this, but I think this would be helpful to many. So let's see, you have to kind of look into permissions and membership. So who can use these facilities, and if you need to fill out certain forms or get permissions or get signatures from a higher authority somewhere. Most archives, many archives are open to everyone, but some archives might require you to have a sort of signature of a teacher of a history teacher somewhere, or an institution, or so on. So you have to kind of, before you make plans to kind of begin your research, find out what are the guidelines, what are the permissions required, and what is the membership procedure, if there is one. Again, rules and procedure. Familiarize yourself with the procedure and rules. Timings, for instance, whether books in a library, whether books you're allowed to take out books or not, or how many can you take out at a time, the duration, how long you can keep them, when you need to renew them. Rare books, for instance, sometimes a library will not allow you to take out books that are in a very fragile condition, or a kind of very rare, precious book, so on and so forth. Okay, now you've gone to the archive, you have, you're allowed to use it, but now how do you start? How do you enter? And again, as I said, this sounds extremely basic, but my own experience tells me that it is a maze, and you really need some help negotiating this maze. So the first thing that you have to look for is, of course, the archivist, the senior archivist, or the librarian, someone who is manning the desk. But they will typically give you a catalog. The catalog could be online, or it could be in physical form. The catalog will have a database. You will be able to see what are the sections under which things are filed. Sometimes things are cross-referenced. So for instance, let's say a document that applies to X subject is also filed under Y category. And this is sort of, there's a cross-referencing, so it is possible for you to go back and forth and find this document. But once you, again, just like the background material, as I said, do not be daunted. Look at it, and if you don't understand it, do not worry. Just sort of commence, and slowly, as you start, just ask for one file, for instance. Once you start looking at it, it's like learning a new language. The grammar of it slowly becomes kind of apparent, and you begin to be much more at ease with it. And as you begin, new ideas will strike you, and you will be able to kind of negotiate these pathways much more easily. Another tip, always look out for helpful people. As I said, libraries and archives can be a maze and they can be intimidating, but a smart librarian or an archivist can make a lot of difference. So find someone who will understand what you are looking for, or is willing to help you navigate this maze. Okay, carry with you pencils, because some places you're not allowed to use pens. So always keep pencils with pens, sharpeners, erasers, post-its, bookmarks, notepads and pens to take notes, an iPad if you want to carry one. Some archives allow photography, in which case carry a camera and make sure it is charged, even though most libraries and other facilities will have charging points. Also, check the capacity of your camera, if there is a sort of limit, or how much you can store in your device's memory. Be sure to turn off the flash. I was once in an archive and I could not get my flash to turn off, and I had very little time and I was getting quite desperate, and there was a kind person who sort of helped me out. So figure out your devices and the technology, etc., so that you are well prepared when you have in that little time you can do as much as is possible. Some archives do not permit you to keep a phone with you, in which case it's better to have a separate camera. You will figure this out over time. Be considerate. Some papers and books are very delicate, can fray easily. Be very, very careful. Clip your fingernails. Treat the papers with utmost care. This is a precious resource, so keep it in good order for others who will come after you, just as this was preserved for your use. And lastly, go prepared. Ask other researchers for advice. What is allowed, what is not. Ask researchers how things are stored, how things are categorized. Go prepared with all your instruments and tools. Read the rules before. Carry something to eat, perhaps, in case you have to spend the whole day in the archives. So, just I'm sorry, this is slightly out of context. Oh, okay. So yes, let us proceed. So far I've spoken of the library and the archive. I'm going to kind of talk also about newspaper and magazine files here. Back issues of newspapers and magazines can be very, very useful source of information. Now, of course, a lot of this material is on the net, but sometimes you do need to look at physically, and particularly if it's a very old issue of a magazine, you perhaps might want to look at the page as it is. Some might want to look at if there are any advertisements or if there are any other announcements. So they want to look at and how the date is presented and the title and the font and everything. So whichever way you kind of look at it, this is a very useful resource as well. It gives you, for instance, looking at old magazines in case you are trying to bring a certain era to life. Let's say that we're talking about the middle of the 20th century. And then to know what kind of clothes people were wearing at the time, what were the advertisements at that time all about, what were the things that interested people, what were the subjects that were being written about, what were the photographs like. All this can add a lot of color to your and detail to your work. And of course, you might be trying to actually track down something in particular. So that would be useful as well. As I said, much of this now, many publications have archived they have digitized their archives. So you might find this quite easily in the net, or through certain libraries which have access to these digitized archives, or the newspaper offices themselves, which might give you access to them. And typically, if you're not looking at them in a digitized form, then you might find them stored on film. Microfiche newspapers are film newspapers. This is what it looks like. There's a sort of computer, and you you kind of roll the, you sort of rather than scrolling, you kind of turn the wheel and look at the newspaper page by page. Okay, microfiche basically uses microphotography to reduce an image onto a roll of plastic film. The format is a 4 by 6 inch plastic card. So as I said, these are microfiche newspapers. These are the tips for the new library or archive user, as I mentioned. Let you look at it for a few seconds. Let us come to another important and widely used method for research, which is the interview. Interviews are the essence of nonfiction research. Interviews could be with a whole range of people. They could be participants, primary sources, secondary sources, experts, people who can just add a little detail. Really, it's kind of actually very, very useful to spread, to cast your net quite wide and follow up all leads. Anyone who you think is interesting or can add something to your book, you should follow up. It's worthwhile because people, it's kind of quite wonderful how varied people are and what varied details they remember. I remember I was trying to do some research at one time, and there was one person who I was talking to, and I suddenly realized that that person could tell me something about the cars that were there in a certain place at a certain time. Another person I knew could tell me about the food that might have been cooked in a home that I was writing about. You kind of don't know who will be able to tell you what. Sometimes when you're just talking to someone, you suddenly get a sense of what they look for, what interests them, and then you know that they might remember these particular details better than someone else. So I find it very useful to actually interview a lot of people when I'm doing research. And as I said, all these, even if you find just a sliver of data from someone, eventually it all adds up and it gives you a lot more material to work with than if you want to have a wealth of material rather than have scanty resources in terms of material. Now, how to do interviews for nonfiction? It's a little different from, let's say, interviews that you would do for journalism, for instance. Journalistic interviews are usually short and pointed. They kind of usually related to a particular recent event that you're writing about, something that's in the news. Interviews for a book are tend to be longer and more open-ended. You are trying to kind of you have gone in expecting to sort of uh, uh, leaving things open to see where it goes. And sometimes you might find that someone who you thought was just a bystander was actually a very critical, crucial witness to an event. And so it is kind of useful to go with some time and lead the interview in a way that allows it to kind of flow rather than ask very sort of abrupt, hurried questions. Let there be a sense of sort of ease. Of course, it does matter. You have to kind of see whether your interviewee has time and is free to talk or wants to talk. But it does help if you kind of go in with yourself prepared for this sort of longer interview. Now, some tips for conducting interviews for popular nonfiction books is make a list of potential interviewees, reach out, introduce yourself, explain your purpose, and politely request an interview. Do your homework, very, very important. Your background reading. Well, background reading in general, background reading on the subject that you are writing about, and if you know a little bit something about the person you are going to meet as well, will help you prepare a kind of sensible list of questions, and you'll have a more rewarding interview. List your questions, but feel free to kind of change the order if you think that the conversation is going somewhere else, not the way you kind of envisaged. Recording, well, if you plan to record an interview, then you must ask for permission. and make sure that your equipment is in working order. There's nothing more irritating than stopping and starting and not knowing what you're doing with your recording equipment. Put your interviewee at ease. That is extremely important. Be firm but flexible. Make sure you get your answers, but allow the interviewee some freedom. Don't be very rigid, as I said, about your order of questions. That might need to change. Something new might strike you as you're going along, and you might need to discard some of the questions you had planned to ask. So don't go with your questions like some sort of rule book. Feel little free and flexible, but within that flexibility, make sure that you do kind of get at least some of the information that you are looking for. And of course, respect your interviewee, build rapport by listening and showing genuine interest. And of course, when confidentiality is requested, you must respect that. So here is a list. Again, I will let you consider it for a few seconds. Okay, let's move on. Now, how do we know that a book has been well researched? Since this course is for readers and writers, so whether you're a reader and a writer, how do you evaluate the research in a book that you are reading? I mean, I suppose experience, but reading many books, you will start kind of reading many books, and I assume that you must have read some books and not necessarily thought about the quality of research. But now that we are talking about research, perhaps you can cast your mind back on some of the books you have read and think about which book communicated a sense of good research, a sense of a quality should come with good research. Good research also aids good writing, and good writing, of course, helps to give you that impression of quality. But good research will certainly communicate itself. A well-researched book is rigorous in checking and authenticating information from reliable sources and sharing the same with the reader. We are not going to kind of talk a lot about verification and so on and authentication, but one does, as good research, for doing good research, you do need to cross-check what you have found, unless, of course, something comes out of a primary source, a letter, and so you're not necessarily, I mean, that letter is the source and the document is the kind of verification. But if you hear something, or if in your interview you come across some data, then it is wise to check that information with other sources, because very often, memories can be fallible. Sometimes people say something because they're confused, or they have forgotten certain things, and or they've just been mistaken, or someone is deliberately trying to mislead. All these things can happen in the process of research. So it is important to kind of verify your information, possibly by, with more sources, 2 or more sources, cross-check. And these are things that will, come with experience. Since it varies from case to case, it's hard to kind of put down some rules over here. But as a reader, you will find a well-researched book much more thorough and more convincing, and offer ways in which you can follow up and check sources of information if required. So, for instance, let's say that a certain fact is communicated to you in a book, that a certain event occurred in May of 1985, and you feel, I'm not quite sure, this doesn't sound right. I thought that this happened in 1995. Now, in a book where a book where most the sources will be listed, somewhere you will find a way to kind of cross-check what the writer has put down, either through there'll be a footnote, or the source from which this information was derived will included in the body of the text. So a good book and a well-researched book will give you this information. A badly researched book, on the other hand, is likely to make assertions that cannot be verified and conclusions that leave one in doubt. I'm not saying this is not a general rule. Again, there are writers and writers and books, and one can't kind of find a way to cover all this in one rule. But this is likely that a badly researched book will communicate the fact that it is badly researched just by being not as convincing as something that is thoroughly researched and gives you, does not just say, take my word for it, but also tells you where you can cross check that particular fact, if it is a significant fact, of course. Okay, so this is about judging a well-researched book. But now, how do you know you are doing a good job as a researcher? Again, one would say by following the example set by well-researched books and by adhering to high standards in verifying and cross-checking. Don't just accept facts as told to you. I mean, I'm not saying suspect everything, but do try and constantly evaluate the information in your mind, evaluate it, place it against your background reading, place it against your reference works, place it against, talk to people who are experts in the field. So if perhaps sometimes it happens that you are researching a certain subject and a little bit of some other piece of information comes your way which you're including, but you're not necessarily going into great depth into that particular aspect, but you could cross check with someone who knows more about that particular area, so that you don't end up making a mistake. And when I say cross check, there is a lot of unchecked, unverified information floating around these days, very easily available to us at the click of a button. So one should be very careful that what one is looking at is some sort of authenticated, reliable information. Also, to do a good job as a researcher, you should follow the rules of proper attribution. So if you are quoting someone, or if you are using material from somebody else's work, then attribute that material, just so that you know where you are sort of giving the source of the information and not just passing it off as your own. And be faithful to your findings. What you do find, once you have cross-checked and verified, and then be faithful to what you have found. What also happens sometimes is that you accumulate a lot of data, and sometimes you get lost in it and forget some of the findings that you yourself have kind of have discovered. So try and go over your material again and again. Value what you have found. These are the qualities one may say are sort of associated with being a good researcher. I would say patience, perseverance, sincerity, the ability to connect dots, really important, and resourcefulness. The last two I haven't talked about too much before, but that is extremely, you have to be alert. You're not a robot just looking at documents. Your mind should be working. Your mind should be working on expanding their value, on expanding their significance, on seeing what that might lead you to, which direction you could take that to. So you might have found a letter 2 weeks ago, and then you might find another letter, and then there is a connection between the two. And if your mind is alert, and if you have been, if you have sort of filed away that data in your mind, then there will be some sort of, your kind of memory will be alerted, and you will be able to connect those dots. Resourcefulness is all important for a researcher. You're constantly being called upon to, your mind has to work very, very quickly at all times. As I said, you might you might find an obstruction in the form of a particular folder has gone missing in an archive, for instance, or an interviewee who you thought was going to be very valuable is not actually telling you anything of any significance, and then you have to kind of find ways to acquire what you have lost, to make up for that loss. So you have to work very, very quickly. I was once, for instance, researching a certain person who had been at a certain time in a certain university in the UK, and this was in the early 1900s, and I couldn't find that information. I mean, I couldn't find anything about it, and then I found a book by someone who was at the same university at the same time, though there was no connection between the two. But that person had given so many details. She had given the weather, the kind of the look of the place at the time, and so that was a kind of completely lucky strike. But it wouldn't have fallen into my hands had I not been trying to say, how can I get more information, and just, as I said, cast your net wide, and sometimes you just find very rich data from a completely unexpected source. Okay, so now we've kind of covered the ground in terms of conventional sources of research and somewhat unconventional, and I've talked about how a non-fiction writer uses details and uses data not just as content, but also to kind of evoke settings, to animate characters, to provide atmosphere, so on and so forth. And we will talk more about this when we talk about style in one of the later lectures. But I want to now just go off in a slightly different direction and talk about research that is even more sort of is even more important in the context of non-fiction, and that is things that actually don't look like research. It doesn't look like data, right? I mean, when I say the word data, you'd normally think of documents and books and things that people have said, and writings that people have left behind. But in popular non-fiction, data can be just many, many more things. It can be the fragrance of flowers, it can be maps, it can be feelings, it can be memories, it can be sights, sounds, of course, letters, documents, etc. Everything is a potential source of data for a non-fiction writer. I want to talk about this. So I want to talk about a couple of books that use unconventional data. So there's a book by Aanchal Malhotra called Remnants of a Separation, where the raw material for contemplation is not documents or records, but objects. So this book is a study of the belongings carried by refugees migrating across the border during the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. I want to read a few lines from here. It's also up. Kuch nahi laaye the, we brought nothing, we came with nothing, was easily the first response I got from whoever I asked about their belongings from 1947. But then things would eventually crawl out of the backs of closets, suitcases and trunks, sheathed in dust and infused with dormant memories. In the fall of 2013, with the hope of converting my interest into my MFA dissertation, I began my quest for objects. And predictably enough, it began at home. My Dadi's mother had brought with her a piece of jewelry, a Mang Tika, given to her by her mother-in-law at her wedding, and then passed down to my Dadi at hers. She had carried this across with the hope of selling it, coming into some money and using that to pay for the education of her children. My Dadi had brought, almost accidentally, a small foldable knife. My Dada's family, having fled their home in Malakwal and having to stay in a makeshift refugee camp in the local cotton factory, were not able to bring much from their home. His mother's main concern had been food, but because they couldn't flee with eatables, she made sure to carry their utensils, so that at least if ration was given in the camp, they would have the means to cook it. As a result, what accompanied them were pital, plates, tumblers, kadhais, and spoons, all with my great grandfather's initials given to him as part of his wife's trousseau. So you understand, this is data. This is the material on which this particular book has been mounted. Let's take now a memoir like Farah Bashir's Rumors of Spring, A Girlhood in Kashmir. Here, what is the raw data? It's recollections. Now, it is likely that the writer has kept notes, kept a diary, and relies on that. As I said before, and we've talked now before about keeping notes, jotting down things, writing down experiences and observations, and so on. And this, as I said, then can become extremely rich material at some point. So, as I said, one's own memory bank can be one's archive. Sometimes it seems as if, there has been no research done in a non-fiction book. Sometimes it might seem that there is no research here. But it is also possible that the research has preceded the conception of the book idea. So, for instance, an architect, who's already read a lot and has thought a lot, and even his observations, his or her observations of the way, for instance, light falls on the floor of a building, is recording data. That observation is also data. And all that person has studied in the past will kind of come back and inform that particular book idea. And of course, whatever fresh research that person does. But not actively doing research at that point does not mean that the research process has not been undergone in some other way. So I wanted to kind of talk, for instance, about a humorist who studies human foibles and observes human behavior in doing research. That is research too. So with that in mind, for On the Bookshelf, with this lecture, I just wanted to talk about, I'm sorry I could not get a clearer image here. This is a picture of a book of the collections of the works of Behram Contractor, more popularly known as Busy Bee. He was a Bombay-based journalist and humorist. He's been compared to great humorists of the world, but he belonged so typically to his city, which he loved and described and brought to life its many characters and its many happenings and so on and so forth. And even though he is well known as a columnist, not as a writer of books, the reason I want to talk about him a bit here is because his columns have a sense of permanence and have been collected in books. Again, I wanted to talk about him here because his is a different kind of research. I've talked earlier about being one kind of writer of nonfiction is a specialist, someone who specializes as a special interest and then wants to share it, communicate it with the world. Someone who is, for instance, perhaps has an interest in organic gardening, for instance, or in cooking a certain kind of food or whatever, and wants to share it. So yeah, Busy Bee or Behram Contractor, his data. He wrote about food, so his data, you can say, came from tasting food, and his data came from observation because he was a really fine observer, so fine an observer, and he wrote with such sort of lightness and clarity that he's sort of a social diarist, a social historian of the city. And so I just want to read a few lines from one of his columns. The India Coffee House, which was the main coffee house, was situated in a large cavern of a place next to the Chicago radio building at Kalagoda. The place is now occupied by one of the public sector banks. I think it is the Bank of India, though it could be the Bank of Baroda. It makes no difference. They are all the same, overstaffed and underserviced. The India Coffee House had excellent service waiters in white turbans looking like Raj servants, scores of tables and cane chairs scattered around steaming coffee pots with vadas and cashew nuts being taken around. A lot of talk, no air conditioning. Everybody knew everybody. Waiters knew customers, customers knew other customers. Mainly they were advertising people, automobile salesmen, insurance agents, but very few journalists or artists. They could not afford coffee. Um, anyway, do look up Behram Contractor and see if you can find more of his writing. He's really delightful to read. Um, I just want to kind of wind up with a few words on just that doing research is like really like diving into the sea. It is boundless. There are no limits, and there is a very, very real danger that one will not know where to stop, because the deeper you go, the temptation is to keep going, and it requires will and experience to extricate yourself and to know when one has the story. It's an art to know when to stop. So how does one know when enough is enough? Deadlines are helpful. Some sense of time and accountability is useful, but experience is the only answer. One knows when one has got the story. You know, one knows it. There is a kind of a moment when one says, yes, you know, aha, I have it. Or at least you have the bulk of it, and you can always go back and fill in the blanks. And one has to stop somewhere, because at the end of the day, one is doing research not for itself, but with the goal of writing a book. And the needs of the book must assert themselves, telling us it is time to stop and move on. So I'm going to now these are a few reference books which you might want to look at if you want to know more about research methods for writers, and other tips. So this concludes lecture 6, Doing Research for Popular Nonfiction 2 of our course, Appreciating and Writing Popular English Nonfiction Books. Thank you.
Hello, I am Shikha Dikshit. I teach psychology and I am with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Kanpur. Today I am going to talk about what is health psychology. In the recent past, health psychology has emerged as one of the important areas in psychology. It is a field of study where psychological theories and concepts are applied to understand issues regarding health and illness. The two major themes which health psychologists are interested in studying are the themes of illness experience and behaviors associated with that experience. Contemporary health psychology adopts various and diverse kind of perspectives to understand health and illness issues. These perspectives include the behavioral perspective, the societal perspective and the cultural perspective. If we try to enumerate the kind of topics that health psychologists study, the range is very wide. To name a few of the topics, health psychologists study cognitions related to illness, that is health and illness related cognitions, social cognitive aspects of health and illness, cognitive adaptation, chronic illness and adaptation to chronic illness, disability, stress and management of stress. Health psychologists also study topics such as health related quality of life, social support and various kinds of coping mechanisms that people adopt to deal with illness experience. In addition to this kind of experience, health psychologists also study healthcare systems, health promotion and treatment related aspects, including doctor-patient relationships. So, as we see, the range of topics is very large. Health psychologists also use qualitative methods, and they study topics such as narratives of illness experience as well as social representations of health and illness. So, we see that the range of these topics is very large. However, this is not an exhaustive list. More recently, some health psychologists have adopted a critical health psychology approach. These health psychologists are, they offer a critique of mainly of the biomedical and behavioral perspective of health and illness, as well as the methods and approach which is used to understand health and illness. So, critical health psychologists focus on the social, cultural and political aspects of health issues. If we look at the methodological aspects, overall health psychologists adopt quantitative methodology, they also use qualitative methodology, and many health psychologists use the mixed method approach.